Today, let's discuss whether or not it is a good idea to elevate your toes when doing the Romanian deadlift. So quite often you may hear a popular coaching cue to elevate your toes when you're doing a Romanian deadlift or even a stiff-legged deadlift as an attempt to feel the contraction and the stretch more in your hamstring and or to improve your center of mass so you can shift the weight more onto your heels. So whether or not that's a good cue or not, I'll just quickly demonstrate for those who don't know what I'm talking about here. So quite often people will put a plate under their toes like this. They'll still have a typical stance where they're about, shoulder width apart with their foot stance here. And then they'll focus on hinging back. So we'll just use, for simplicity purposes, Romanian deadlift demonstration here. So that's where we're focusing on increasing our knee flexion as we hinge our hips back. So when we do this type of variation, you're typically gonna feel a greater stretch in your hamstrings as well as your calves. So I can feel a pretty good stretch right now in my calves as well as my hamstrings. So in comparison to not elevating, let's take away the plate there, do the same thing. What we are gonna do again is we're hinging our hips back, focusing on increasing our knee bend, so that way it's a Romanian deadlift. Not as much of a stretch that I'm gonna feel in my calves in comparison to when I elevate my toes. So is that increased stretch that I'm feeling a little bit here, but more so in my calves, necessary and important if we're trying to target the hamstrings and more in particular the glutes when we're doing a Romanian deadlift? Is this a good cue? And the answer is not really. It's kind of a band-aid solution on something that needs stitches. Just because you experience a greater stretch in a given area doesn't mean that you're actually targeting that specific area more efficiently. In addition to that, because we are experiencing a greater stretching sensation in our hamstring, that doesn't actually mean that our hamstring is lengthening more in order for us to activate the given area more. So when we elevate our toes, we are increasing our dorsiflexion, so our ankle mobility is improving, but that doesn't actually contribute to greater hamstring activation because the hamstrings don't cross the ankles. So if feeling a greater hamstring stretch is the goal, you have to ask yourself, why are you trying to experience a greater hamstring stretch? And like I previously said, a Romanian deadlift, if you increase your knee flexion, that's gonna help target your glutes a lot more. If the goal is to target your hamstrings more than the glutes, a simple fix for that is to do a stiff-legged deadlift in comparison to a Romanian deadlift. That has nothing to do with your foot angle, it more so has to do with your knee angle. Another reason why a lot of coaches will give this cue to just simply elevate their toes is they're trying to teach an individual how to hinge properly. And again, this is more of a band-aid solution on something that needs stitches. By elevating your toes, you're not teaching the individual how to hinge correctly. It's more important to take a look at improving your hip hinging technique by doing certain wall cues. I've talked about this in a previous video before. I'll try to link it down below. Make sure you guys go check out that video where I talk about how you can properly learn how to hinge correctly. You do want to make sure that you have an even base when it comes to your center of mass. So by elevating your toes, you're just disrupting that center of mass, which isn't going to allow you to focus on increasing the amount of weight that you're doing because you don't have a stable base. Having your foot completely flat on the ground when you're doing hip hinging movements is extremely important, so that way you can have a stable base and focus on the joints that are moving during that given movement. So that's going to be your hip joint and your knee joint, depending on what you're trying to target. So even though it may feel good on your hamstrings and your calves by elevating your toes like this, again, it's really not doing anything if the overall goal is to maximize hypertrophy. So your muscle growth in your hamstrings, your muscle growth in your glutes, doing this really unnecessary. Get rid of the plate, keep your feet nice and flat and focus on hinging back correctly by maximizing the angles of your hip and your knee joints, and focus on keeping a stable foot position so you can maximize the amount of weight that you're lifting. I don't know if it's just because I just train legs, but just even demonstrating elevating my toes like that, I actually have a little bit of a weird pain behind my knee joints. And when I talk about this, I'm not shaming anybody for ever doing this. I've done this in the past before too. I have fallen victim to some of the creative posts and videos that are shared on social media. You know, a lot of people tend to try to reinvent the wheel as an attempt to stay relevant. And some things are valid and some things are just flat out stupid. For lack of a better word, this makes no sense. So you always want to take the time to ask yourself, like, what am I trying to accomplish here? Does this actually make sense for my given goals? If the answer is no, don't be afraid to just stick to the fundamentals, stick to the basics, and remember that lifting is a skill. Lifting is a skill. They don't reinvent how to do a layup in basketball, right? It's a skill that basketball players do over and over and over again until they perfect it. They can do it with their eyes closed. Lifting is no different for any given movements when it comes to the back squat, deadlift variations, bicep curls, lateral raises. We are living in such a oversaturated market on social media, and it's tough for a lot of influencers. They're trying to stay relevant, and unfortunately, it comes at the expense of a lot of people who are trying to learn and educate themselves of how to lift properly. And we often do forget that there is a lot to be said about just simply mastering the fundamentals and not needing to reinvent the wheel.